Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Entertainment shows produced in Hollywood are, for many of us, a staple of our life and influence how we view the world. In this podcast, we will check in on anti-Semitism in Hollywood today. Our guest is filmmaker James Forsher, who is a long-time producer of films about Hollywood's history. Currently, he is producing the documentary Hiding in Hollywood, which tells the story of the film industry's century-long battle against anti-Semitism within its own community. James, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
So could you describe the anti-Semitism in Hollywood a few months before October 7, and then what happened after October 7?
Anti-Semitism in Hollywood is a loaded topic because anti-Semitism is from outside, and then there's anti-Semitism, which was more of the theme of my film, which was Jews in Hollywood trying to figure out how to live in a world that oftentimes is not very inviting, and so how to deal with that. So that's the complexity of anti-Semitism. You've got the outside forces, is evident by the Kanye West and the Dave Chappelle and Saturday Night Live. And then you've got all of the thousands of people that are Jewish or Jewish identified in Hollywood who have to kind of look at this world and figure out how to deal with it, because it is not, and it has never been, an easy task.
So, but did it change on October 7th and become more difficult?
I think it probably reflects America in general, in the sense that America is very divided now in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community in terms of how to respond to October 7th. So you've got a group that are very loyal to the idea of going in and destroying Hamas, totally getting rid of the last Hamas, which is the Netanyahu government's mission, apparently. And then you've got a group that are saying, well, that's probably not going to help Jews globally that much, because we're just going to be looked at as butchers. And so you've got that conflict in America and in Hollywood. And that's why you've not had a unified voice coming from Hollywood, because there is no unity in the Jewish community here. I'm just looking at my own friends, in Hollywood and outside, and they all have different opinions. So that is making it tougher, on top of the normal anti-Semitism that exists plain.
Well, let's talk about a specific incident that happened 3 years ago when the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences opened the long-awaited museum.
Right.
And then you want to tell that story?
So it was in
what was the museum about? What is the museum about?
Okay, so the Motion Picture Academy opened up a film museum, basically, corner of Wilshire in Fairfax, and it spent years building it. It was supposed to be the story of Hollywood. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, it's a beautiful structure. It's got a great collection in it. They open up, and then the headlines in a number of papers the next day was, "Where are the Jews?" And what they forgot to do in their history of Hollywood was mention anything about the Jewish pioneers that started the film industry. Some people were surprised. I was totally not surprised, because I had spent most of my life trying to sell a story about the man who started Paramount Studios, a man named Adolf Zukor. So Adolf Zukor, no one knows him today, but Adolf Zukor came over from Hungary in 1889. He went on to start some of the earliest penny arcades, brought the very first feature film to America, was one of the co-founders of Paramount Studios, ran Paramount Studios for decades, created Paramount Television, brought really one of the first television. I mean, he was a pioneer's pioneer. did more than anyone to really create Hollywood. And I've talked to the Motion Picture Academy. They're like, oh, that's very nice. They gave me no support in finishing the film on Zukor. And I finally got money to finish that film from a grant that got me to Budapest, Hungary, because he's from Hungary. Well, there were people there that still appreciated Zukor. But here, the Zukor and all the other Jewish pioneers were really largely forgotten. And so when I saw the Motion Picture Academy forget to include Zukor and the others, I was like, oh, yeah, not surprising to me, because that's been my experience for a long time.
But there was pushback. There's pushback.
Well, there was reaction, to it, and it shamed them. And then they said, okay, well, let's have a special exhibit for the Jewish pioneers. And so I was in Budapest when they were working on it. I notified them because I have contacts at the Motion Picture Academy. And I spoke to someone. I said, I've got an interview with Adolf Zukor. My mom was Adolf Zukor's grandson's business partner in early television. I'd be glad. Oh, we don't need it. We don't need it. We'll call you if you. So they put together some Potchki exhibit on the pioneers. That opened, and that got pushback because it was full of tropes. And
no, let's clarify. It was full of anti-Semitic tropes.
Okay, you're right.
Like what? Like what?
Well, the references of cheapness and better deals and all these things that
with no context. With no context.
Right. And it didn't go over well. That got a lot of negative feedback from a wide variety of sources. So they went back and promised to fix that. The problem is they hired the guy that wrote Empire of Their Own, and they thought they had their token guy that could solve it all. Well, he wrote a very interesting, 350, 400-page story of the Jewish experience in Hollywood, but it didn't deal with the outer discussions of anti-Semitism, of what these people had to deal with, how they dealt with anti-Semitism with Henry Ford and with Hearst and with Edison. And those are very, very intense stories. So because those were left out, and because Empire of Their Own, that was not the focus of that book, they had to suffer from it, depending on one expert.
But what happened to the curator of that show?
I don't. Hold on one second. I'm going to let my sorry, dog one is free. I don't know what happened to the curator. I hope he or she got fired. Again, I had such a miserable experience all along, especially offering help and not getting. No one else had an interview with Zucker who talked about starting the industry. I'm the only one that has it. And you'd think they'd want 20 seconds of it just to include somewhere. That really would have.
Sorry, I'm not an insider in Hollywood, and I don't very much understand of what you of the situation you're describing here. So, what is the anti-Semitism that the people in Hollywood at the beginning? I think you're talking about the 20s, the 1920s. Is that correct?
The title to the Zucker documentary was called The Hollywood Mogul Wars. And so the Hollywood Mogul Wars describes exactly what this is about. So when they came over and they saw this motion picture industry, and it was just in the penny arcades at this point, they were going, we see an industry here, and we want to be part of it. Well, the problem they had was there was a man named Thomas Edison who controlled the motion picture industry, because he controlled the patents to the projectors and to the cameras. So Thomas Edison said, none of you can produce. I have my producers. I don't want anything to do with any of you. And so one reason that many of the early filmmakers like Carl Laemmle moved to Hollywood was to get away from Edison and get away from his team of detectives that were actively shutting down filmmakers.
Now, this is in New York. actively shutting down in New York.
In the East Coast, yeah, New
Yes.
Jersey, New York, and they actually even sent detectives out to Hollywood to try to shut them down. Edison sued Laemmle, I read somewhere over 400 times for copyright infringement. And Laemmle finally had enough, and he, representing all the other Jewish pioneers, sued Edison back, and he won in court. So that was the end of Edison's control in going after the Jewish pioneers. Edison had no Jewish producers working for him. I mean, he was, this was a white industry, Christian, dominated by a billionaire industrialist. And so that was the first mogul war, and that was the Jews versus Edison. And it didn't take long for another one named Henry Ford to come along, who wrote a book called The International Jewry. And in International Jewry, he has all types of information about Hollywood and how awful. This is just 5-6 years after Hollywood was created, and he's going after the Jews in Hollywood. So they had to deal with the likes of Henry Ford. William Randolph Hearst declared war on many of
newspaper
the Jewish
mogul. Go ahead.
Yes.
And which
so
years, which decade are you
this is
talking?
all in the early 20s. This is
Okay.
Hollywood itself was created maybe 1915, 16, realistically started to really blossom. Well, by 1921, 22, this is all going on. This is just a few years after the first studios were allowed to be made because Edison was out of the picture. And so the Jews had a problem. They're confronting billionaires that hate Jews. That's a problem. So what they did was, and this was Zukor again, what he did was he went to a friend of his named Will Hayes. Will Hayes was working on the president's administration as a postmaster general. He was a Presbyterian elder, and they hired him to be what they called the film czar. Well, really what the film czar was the front man, the public relations man to America, who could go out to the public and say, I'm the film czar. I'm number one person in all of Hollywood. I'm Christian. I'll take care of these Jews for you. And so the moguls didn't have to deal with the press. They always had Will Hayes that would go to the press and to the public, and he went around the country talking and reassuring everyone that Hollywood's under control because I, a Christian Presbyterian elder, am here. So that's how they dealt with it. That was the first case of major hiding.
Okay. And so you said when the museum about the history of Hollywood was opened not so long ago, they left out the history of anti-Semitism at the beginning of Hollywood.
Well, they left out a complete discussion of the Jewish pioneers' plane, anti-Semitism included, but anti-Semitism was this much of the big story.
In other words, they didn't credit the Jews for starting this industry, the creativity
and
of
the
the
whole
Jews.
story that comes with that.
Yes.
Yeah. But the industry was started by Christian billionaires, you're saying.
The very first incarnation of the industry in America from the 1890s to the 1915 was Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
And he controlled the total U.S. industry.
But
and when did the Jews start to play a substantial role?
They started buying in the early 1910s. They started buying penny arcades, which got them interested in producing. And then Zukor brought over the very first feature film in 1912 from France. And that's when they said, we want to be part of this business too. Thomas Edison, you can't control all of film business. This is global business. This is not just a, U.S. And that's when this 4 or 5 year battle began.
I see. And at the one hand, there is you say, I think rightfully so, we need a representation of also the role of Jews in the early years of Hollywood and their contributions and their contributions to the growth of the industry. On the other hand, we don't like the anti-Semitic trope that Jews control Hollywood.
Today.
yeah, today. Could you
Yeah.
reflect on that, please?
It's part of the age-old, going back 2000 or 1500, 1600 years of the series of tropes about Jewish control of industries, Jewish controls of money, Jewish controls of power, that, were just used as one more means of disparaging the religious group, based on no facts, just based on, throwing it out and it just sticking. So every few years, the anti-Semites pull that up, and this is the latest manifestation of it. And it is complete nonsense. If you look at the world today, in the entertainment industry today, most of the industries are not controlled by Jews. I don't even know what that means. I mean,
I was going
if
to
you
say,
look
what
at
does
the
that mean?
major studios, um, Jeff Bezos controls, a huge swath of entertainment industry. Sony's owned by Japanese industries. Elon Musk owns X, which is a huge media organization.
Just to
So
clarify, none of these people are Jewish. Okay, keep going.
those people are Jewish. And then the other thing is, industries are made up of thousands of people, meaning if you go to a Paramount, if you go to a HBO, in the list of vice presidents and the directors, whatever, and you look at those credits, most of them are not Jewish. So the idea that there's George Soros at the top and everyone has to call George Soros every day to check in what they're doing, and then he says, okay, I'll give you $1 billion towards it, is a total nonsense manifestation of this trope, of this anti-Semitic trope of hate. And I was watching Saturday Night Live couple of years ago, and Dave Chappelle, comedian, went on and he said, I've been out to Hollywood, and there's a good chance that the Jews control Hollywood. And he just made it as a joke, and people laughed. And I went, oh my God, I mean, it's still alive and present in America. And even though it has absolutely no basis in truth.
Could you mention some people, please, in the entertainment industry today, well-known people who express these anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish control of the industry,
Yeah.
etc.? Who are prominent people saying that? Could you mention?
Well, over the last few years, we've had like the Dave Chappelle comedian who throws it in as part of his act. We've had the Kanye West, nonsense with the tweets. We've had the Mel Gibsons who, get drunk and go off on the Jews. And I mean, they're extremists. They're usually either drunk or, doing a comedic act. So they're out there. What's sad, I'm not surprised about these few people in the industry, because very, very few in the industry will do that. But what's very sad is that, except for a few people like Jamie Lee Curtis, who will sit there and immediately go, that's nonsense, there's very few other people in the industry, because they go back to that 100-year-old version of Adolf Zucker hiring Will Hayes, which is, let's not make a commotion here. Let's just hide. We'll let someone else deal with it. So when Kanye West came out and did that, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger that did the video that came out and said, you shouldn't do this. And I went, here's Will Hayes 100 years later, our Christian Terminator. And he's out once again to save us. And
perhaps, don't you think that may be needed?
It was not just needed, but it was needed by 1,000 other voices.
Yes, see, that's what I would say. It's not that there aren't enough Jews and allies in Hollywood speaking up.
And I think a lot of it has to do with, I grew up in the film industry. My mom worked for Elvis Presley in the 50s. She was hired, I think, looking back, one of the reasons she was hired was Colonel Parker and Elvis were very Christian Southern, and they wanted a Jewish front in the office. And my mom was a very Jewish front from the office. So it was a smart hire by them. But I got to witness firsthand what it meant being Jewish in Hollywood. And most people, even though, it was a lot of Jews as producers and agents and whatever, it didn't do any of them any good meaning that they wouldn't go into a room and say, wink, wink, I'm a Jew. Oh, let's make a special deal. It didn't work that way. There was a comfort level that we kind of understood each other, but I'll screw you in a business deal if I can. That still happened. So it was a very interesting experience to watch that. And it didn't change during my entire life when I went into production in the 70s.
So, in your opinion, why is Hollywood today so reluctant to acknowledge the Jewish founders of the industry here in Los Angeles?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, how Jews are very reluctant um, to be very public about being Jewish. And that really goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to the culture. When you survived in Europe, and my family's from Europe, and I remember the stories. I mean, they were living in shtetls, hiding. They were often kicked out of the main towns, and they learned to survive by not making a big commotion, by sometimes having to go and live in their own little enclaves. And that sense probably is ingrained in the Jewish community in America, where you don't make commotion. You don't bring publicity to yourself. There's not a Jewish Lives Matter movement going on in America. And
Yeah,
there's
where we need
reasons.
one now, probably. Yes.
Well, it's not going to happen because the most Jews, it's not easy being Jewish. And most Jews know that. And so their attitude is life is a lot easier. People don't call me a Jew.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality we live with.
Well, our show is to encourage people, Jews and allies, to speak up, especially now.
Yes.
But once we get past the 30s, I'd just like to talk for a couple of minutes that the Jewish immigrants could be active in the film industry, because once the lawsuit with Edison, there were really no barriers to entry. It wasn't like you had to have a law degree or a medical degree. You had to have gone to Harvard in order to do something. So Jews who were immigrants with basically no schooling, but with creativity could get into the industry.
Yeah, schooling was not what you needed, but talent you did. And it was an open field, meaning the studio heads didn't sit there and say, let's only hire Jews. That was not what they did. What they did was they said, let's hire the most talented people we can find out there. And that, if that includes Jews, that's great. Many of those Jews changed their names so they'd be more copacetic to the public outside. So, Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis. I mean, all these people had to become Americanized names, anglicized names. So that was the reality of the world that they lived in. So it wasn't
they changed their names to names that didn't sound so Jewish.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's, and that happens today. I mean, Jonah Hill, big actor. His sister kept her name Feldstein, but Jonah changed his name from Feldstein to Hill. So it's not gone. It's still very much a lot.
Whereas Whoopi Goldberg changed her name to a Jewish sounding name,
which was a comedic movement. I mean, because that was funny. Because here's this obviously very, very Black woman with a very Jewish sounding name, and it worked for her. And Sammy Davis Jr., the same thing. He embraced Judaism because it was the type of thing that would get attention. And he's Black. He doesn't care. They're already an ostracized group. So, let's go with it.
Well, what can our listeners do today to combat anti-Semitism in the industry, both internally, because it does still exist, and externally in terms of the way certain films or TV shows do negative images of Jews, particularly if they want to show someone Jewish, they choose frequently to show someone who's Hasidic instead of just looks like the three of us.
Yeah, or the Goldbergs on TV, or whatever. I can talk about my journey over the last year, which is, I've asked that question too. And over 40 years of making films, I rarely, if ever, touched the topic of Judaism in Hollywood, even though it was I was very aware of it, but I didn't find networks who were buying it. I pitched it many times, and I never found a network saying I want it. So that's one reality we're living with. No one wants to kind of talk about the Jews in Hollywood. No one
And
wants to
why is
see it.
that? They don't want to give us credit, or
Well,
Maybe,
I
or
put it to
maybe
a
the
test.
audience, or maybe the audience is not interested in it.
I think you have a point there. Evelyn, you really nailed it, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so I did I have a communication consultancy business. I did a communication consultancy a few months ago for a local nonprofit. And without going into big details, after 3 months, I got some emails back and the discussions in the office, and realized it was a nice it was a nice nonprofit, but the people running it were blatant anti-Semites.
oh, that's
And that was not fun. And it really it pissed me off because I had to face it eye to eye on a daily basis for several months. And so I came back and I looked at my Zucker documentary and I said, this story is not really just about Zucker. This is about anti-Semitism in Hollywood. And so I went back to recut my Zucker documentary and renamed it Hiding in Hollywood. And that was a very interesting experience because when I did it, one way I test to see if there's any interest in a topic of a film is to put it on a crowdsource, which is a crowdsourcing is where you put it on Kickstarter and places like that. And I use a Seed and Spark, and you really promote it. You get newspaper articles, you get on podcasts, you let the world know that this story. So I'm telling the story of anti-Semitism in Hollywood from today going back to Zucker's days. Thousands of people saw articles on it, messengers, Facebook. I mean, I really did the 400 news releases were sent by a friend of mine who runs a public relations company. I got 4 pledges.
now wait, you need to compare it with pledges you've gotten for other documentaries.
Okay, so for example, I did a documentary just a few years ago on a guy named Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek. I got, I think, 600 pledges for that. And, I mean, the big deal with Gene Roddenberry is on his show, they allowed an interracial kiss. Well,
right.
I mean, yeah, it was a pretty awful show, very low budgeted, but they had an interracial kiss, and that's what goes down in history as an interracial crew, interracial kiss. But, anyway, he had an interesting story, but you had people that were not afraid to support him. So several hundred I get from that. I got 4 people supporting it over the last month on this. And it really showed me. So I was talking to my wife and I said, this is awful. And she said, who wants to see a documentary about Jews in Hollywood? I don't want to watch it. Would you? And part of me said, well, of course. And then part of me said, oh, I get it. It goes along with this hiding. They don't want to deal with it. So going back to what you're saying, Evelyn, is what do you do? And it was very painful for me to do this, but I don't regret doing it because I think right now we have to act. And acting is getting in people's faces and saying, oh, what you just said is an anti-Semitic trope. Let me explain that to you. And that's exactly what I had to do with this nonprofit I worked with. When I got an email from them accusing me of wanting a better deal, which had no basis in any fact, because actually I had agreed to a price reduction in my pay because they were having financial problems. And then I got an email from one of their idiots saying, oh, you went on a better deal. And I said, oh, and let me tell you about what you just said. That's called an anti-Semitic trope. Why? Because Jews for hundreds of years have always been accused of always wanting a better deal, as if you would want to go to a store and pay more just because you're Christian. That's insanity. And I wrote that and I said, I'm done talking to you. I'm only talking to the board. You really need to do some discussions amongst yourselves because what you did was not good. And I'm proud of myself for saying
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
lost $8,000 a month consultancy fee, but something I couldn't live with myself
Wow.
if I didn't do that.
Wow.
And I think
I commend you. I commend you for that, for doing that.
we all have to do that. We all have to confront the idiots and say, no, that's not correct. Let me explain you why. So maybe if you don't know the history of anti-Semitism, read up on it. There's lots of articles on it. And next time someone says something stupid and they don't even realize it's an anti-Semitic statement, you just say, oh, by the way, that's an anti-Semitic statement. Let me tell you why that maybe is something you shouldn't be saying. And confront people on that.
No, no, not confront, educate. What you did was exactly good. Explaining
Well,
to people.
I looked at it as a confrontational education.
No, I think it was doing a service to them, because what if they said that to the next person and it could really hurt the nonprofit, you see? So you really did a service by explaining. And that was the problem with the Jewish exhibit at the Academy, because they would say things like, so-and-so was a tyrant, I understand, without saying, in those days, the way studios worked was XYZ. And they also called someone a womanizer, I understand, without, again, explaining in those days how the whole system worked, but just labeling these Jews with one or two words: tyrant, womanizer.
Sure. And that's, and it may be true within today's context, but not within the context of 1920 America.
Yeah, exactly. That's what.
And they didn't put anything in context.
There was no Me Too movement then yet.
There was no me anything. I did a documentary a few years ago on Hal Roach, Little Rascals. What no one talks about today, but what I found fascinating about Hal Roach was in 1920, he signed Sunshine Sammy to a studio contract. Sunshine Sammy was one of the first members of the Little Rascals. And he was 6 years old, and he was a great actor. And when I interviewed Roach at 90, he's saying, I just signed him because he was a great actor. And, he faced censorship here and there. It didn't matter. And he had a great team, Little Rascals. Everyone loved them, even if they were interracial. And soon all these studio or the theaters that were
segregated,
stereotyping, and didn't want the African Americans, they were playing it because they realized they're losing money and everyone likes it and it's not a problem. And so Hal Roach did more for that. Daryl Zanuck, going back 30 years later. So Daryl Zanuck was the head of production for 20th Century Fox. He applied to the LA Country Club. They wouldn't let him in. And they thought he was Jewish. Well, Daryl Zanuck wasn't Jewish, but he learned the lesson of what it was like to be Jewish. So he saw this book called Gentleman's Agreement, which was about anti-Semitism in America during that period. And he licensed it to make a film out of it. And all the Jewish producers and studio heads went to him and saying, don't do this. We don't want to bring attention. He said, no, I'm not afraid. I'm not Jewish. And this is a story that has to be told. And it turned out, Gregory Peck was great in it. It won awards. Elie Kazan directed it. And he confronted it. But again, it took a non-Jew to do that. Luckily we have people like Spielberg who did Schindler's List today, who are trying to confront it head on. It's a very tough battle.
So as we wrap up our talk, is there anything else that you think we should point out to people, especially if they can act instead of just talk?
Yeah, I think educate yourself to what the history of anti-Semitism is. Educate yourself to today to the battles just within the Jewish community. And that it's really got to come to an end. Jews battling each other over some political ideas is not good. We don't live in a bubble. We live in a world full of people that hate us for traditions that go back to the New Testament, in writings that said we killed Christ, and that's what started it. And it just went downhill from that. Hey, sorry.
education is very important. And then we can be prepared to respond without anger in context when someone says something to us.
And respond and be vocal, use the social media. If you see something that's wrong, you just comment on it. You don't have to have a war about it, but you can just sit there and say, I didn't like that. That wasn't funny to me. And oftentimes people that are anti-Semitic don't even know they're being anti-Semitic.
Okay.
And if you just sit there and say, gee, I'm Jewish and that didn't go over well, that will be enough to shock them that maybe they have to be a little more careful and be a little more self-aware.
Yeah. And especially today, when criticism of Israel spills over into hatred of Israel, or even not acknowledging the right to exist of Israel, it's important we educate ourselves about when does this kind of criticism become anti-Semitic. How can we explain it to people who say such things but don't even understand it's anti-Semitic? And how do we deal, as you said in the beginning of this interview, how do we deal with the big debate within our own community about Israel today, right? Without becoming a split community. And how do we deal with our with our polarized political views on other issues without becoming a split community? Because we cannot afford to be
Exactly.
split.
We need to be united.
No, I totally agree with you, Evelyn. I mean, that's the world we live in.
Right.
Oh, I want to thank you so much for coming on this show. I want to thank our listeners. For those of us who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every episode, we say, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.